This is a video for the coastal zone for GCSE Geography AQA specification. So the first part of the specification states that you need to know what the coast is shaped by. And this includes weathering, mass movement, types of waves, erosion, deposition, and transportation. So for this first part of the video, I'll take you through all of these in detail one by one. So we'll begin with weathering. Firstly, we've got mechanical weathering, and this is when a physical force breaks down rocks, such as freeze-fall. So freeze-fall is when water gets into cracks on cliff faces, for example, and freezes, which causes water to expand by 9% in volume, because that's what happens when water freezes, and therefore dislodges blocks of rocks, and they fall. So that's one way the coast is shaped by. The second weathering process it's shaped by is chemical weathering, and this is basically erosion by chemical reactions such as carbonation. So this is a pretty simple concept. Take a rock such as limestone, and this is when it slowly dissolves due to rainfall, for example. And in the case of limestone, because rainfall is a weak carbonic acid with pH 5.6, it produces calcium bicarbonate in solution. But you don't need to know that. That's more A level. But if you really want to impress the examiner, then do so. And at several points in this video, I will go into things in slightly more detail to A level standards. So for those of you doing the higher paper, for example, you can use this and hopefully boost your mark up by 1 or 2 marks. But this isn't really necessary, but I'll still say it. So next we've got mass movement. So the first one we've got is rockfall, which is where blocks of rock is dislodged from cliff face, often by freeze-fall weathering. So a pretty simple concept, don't really need to explain that. As I said, water gets into the cracks, freezes, expands, dislodges blocks of rocks, and the rock falls. The next one we've got landslide, which is the movement of rocks by sliding downhill. Again, pretty simple concept. If you've got a permeable rock, so a soft rock such as clay, water gets in, it weakens it, and it slides downhill. Next we've got mud flow, so weak and saturated rocks flowing down slopes. Again, because rain, for example, has got in, added to its weight, and it's flowed or slid downhill. And lastly, rotational slip, slumps of saturated material found along curved surfaces. Don't really need to explain that further, but yeah, these for mass movement, it's pretty simple concepts. Next we've got constructive waves. So these waves have a strong swash, a weak backwash, and they're less frequent. So the strong swash, it means that it deposits material on the beach, and it forms a beach berm. So the strong swash deposits sediment and forms these beach berms. However, the backwash, it's really weak, so the water just dissolves, perlocates. Better word to use, perlocates into the beach, and it doesn't really have an impact on how the coast is shaped. But the strong swash does have an impact on how the coast is shaped because it forms a beach berm, and they're less frequent. These occur there are about 6 or 7 of these per minute, so they're not as frequent. Destructive waves, however, they contrast constructive waves because they have a weak swash and a strong backwash. So this weak swash doesn't really do anything. Again, it just kind of perlocates into the beach. However, the strong backwash, it actually dissolves, it erodes the beach. It erodes the sediment on these beach berms and deposits them offshore, which forms an offshore bar. These are formed by storms, and they're a lot more frequent, about 14 to 16 times per minute, which is quite frequent. Next up, we've got erosional processes, and I'll begin with the one that, in my opinion, is the most important one. I mean, erosional processes are so common. They come up in at least once every 2 years in exam papers. Examiners love them, so really remember these. So I'll begin with hydraulic action, the most important one in my opinion. This is when air is forced into cracks by waves, causing the blocks of rock to be dislodged. Do not confuse this one with freeze-fall. Freeze-fall weathering is when water gets into cracks, freezes, expands, causes blocks of rock to be dislodged. Hydraulic action is when air is forced into cracks, causing the cracks to expand and therefore dislodge the blocks of rock. A way to remember this: freeze for weathering, water freezes. Hydraulic action, A for action, A for air. Do not confuse these. And hydraulic action usually occurs in rocks, such as sedimentary rocks that have many cracks. Sedimentary rocks have many cracks, and if you really want to impress the examiner, use the A-level term heavily jointed. This basically means many cracks. But you don't need to stress yourself too much about this A-level term. It's just, if you're doing higher or even foundation, you just want to impress the examiner, hopefully boost your marks by 1 or 2, then do so. Heavily jointed, many cracks. This is where hydraulic action occurs a lot, because there are a lot more cracks available, vulnerable for waves, for freeze for, and for hydraulic action, even air from waves and water from waves to get in, freeze or expand and therefore dislodge blocks of rock. Moving on, abrasion. This is when waves pick up sediment and hurl it at cliff faces, causing the cliff face to be smoothened down. So this usually occurs when the cliff face has fairly loose sediment, because they're a lot more vulnerable to these bits of sediment to be knocked off, to be dislodged and smoothened down. So the sediment is hurled at cliff faces and smoothing them down. Fairly simple concept. So attrition is when the sediment clashes within high energy waves, causing them to become smaller and rounded over time. So another fairly simple concept: 2 bits of sediment, rather raggedy, quite pointy, a lot of bits that can be chipped off. They keep banging against one another, they chip off these little fragments, they become rounded over time, and because bits of the rock are being chipped off, they become a lot more smaller. So a lot of people tend to confuse attrition and abrasion. Even I did, but then I came up with a way to remember it, which is attrition. It sounds like the word attractive. So the sediment, they're quite ugly and they need to be chipped off before, but now they're a lot more attractive because they're smaller and rounded. So attrition is when they become attractive, smaller and rounded, because the sediment clashes in high energy waves. And solution, I think, is the most simple to remember actually. This is when soft rocks dissolve due to weak acids, such as seawater. I can't really explain that. It's just the soft rocks become dissolved, really. So, moving on, we have got deposition, which occurs as waves lose their energy and deposit sediment. So, when a wave is not approaching the shore yet, it's got quite a lot of energy because there could be a storm present, for example, and then as they approach the coast, they lose their energy eventually because they are approaching the shore and they deposit this sediment. So the last bit you need to know for how the coast is shaped are transportational processes. So we'll begin with traction. This is when large sediment is rolled along the seabed by powerful waves. These are usually boulders, for example. They're quite large. And a way to remember this: traction, large sediment; tractor, it's large; traction, large sediment. That's how I remembered it. These next 3, saltation, suspension, and solution, I could never find a way to remember these. I think they're just those things you just kind of have to know. So saltation is the bouncing of sediment along the seabed. Suspension, sediment carried in the water column. And solution, as I said before, dissolved material carried in water as a solution. So solution involves dissolved material, and suspension just involves sediment in its own form. And lastly, longshore drift, a very famous concept that the examiners love. This is the I did not highlight that well enough. Let me just sort that out. There we go. Longshore drift. It's the movement of sediment along the coast due to prevailing winds coming at an angle. So for quite a couple of years, the examiners have not asked about longshore drift. I don't think they did in my exam last year anyway, but from what I can remember, they haven't. So I would advise to definitely be very head-on with this topic. So longshore drift is the movement of sediment along the coast due to prevailing wind. And as you can see here, the movement of sediment onto the beach, it's parallel to the direction of prevailing wind. And another thing, if you're asked to draw the diagram, this has to be going down at a right angle. This has to be perpendicular. That didn't come out very well. This line here has to be perpendicular. You may get a nice examiner, you may not. They might let you off, but I would advise you to definitely do this perpendicularly, so that it is at a right angle, as you can see there. So now we've got landforms arising from erosion. Headlands, we'll start with headlands. They are basically more resistant rocks sticking out to sea, as they're vulnerable. They're less vulnerable to erosion. So yeah, so headlands, more resistant rocks sticking out to sea, as they are less vulnerable to erosion. In contrast to that, we have got bays, which form directly next to headlands. They are less resistant and they're more vulnerable to, oh god, that was terrible. They are more vulnerable to erosion, and sediment such as sand is deposited. So an A-level term, a concordant coastline. That is when you have alternating types of rock, so hard rock and soft rock. This is a bay here. Oh god, that's terrible. But yeah, you've got a headland, and you've got a bay, a headland, and a bay, etc. You know what I mean. So hard rock, soft rock, hard rock. So this is a concordant coastline. You don't need to know this for GCSE, but again, show off to the examiner. A concordant coastline is when the type of rock, or rock strata, may I add, rock strata, another A-level term, type of rock, are alternating. So you've got hard and soft, hard and soft. And as you can see here, this soft rock has eroded and has formed a bay where sediment such as sand is deposited, but the more resistant hard rock has been left sticking out to sea because it's less vulnerable to erosion. So this is the headlands and this is the bay. I will color code this actually. So headlands I will make purple, bays I will make light blue. So the bay here, and then we've got the headlands here and here. So moving on, we've got wave cut platforms, and this is when erosion at the foot of the cliff causes blocks of rock to be dislodged and fall. So you've got a cliff face, and erosion occurs at the foot of the cliff depending on the height of the cliff, but usually it occurs at the foot. And over time, the cracks, the hydraulic action occurs, and the airs get into the cracks, or even freeze-fall weathering occurs, gets into the cracks, but mainly hydraulic action and abrasion even. Over time it erodes the foot of the cliff, it forms a wave-cut notch, and eventually it becomes very unstable and very vulnerable, and it falls, it topples over. Yeah, so it topples over, and the rock that fell becomes eroded away or carried away, and this continuously occurs. Erosion at the foot of the cliff, over time, vulnerable, collapses, and again, it keeps receding inlands. And what's left over is a horizontal rock platform, which is known as a wave-cut platform. And lastly, we've got cracks, cave, arches, stacks, and stumps. Resistant rocks have joints or faults, as I said before. Joints, faults, they're both cracks. Another A-level term, so the cracks, and they expand due to erosion, mainly hydraulic action. So resistant rocks have joints and faults and expand due to erosion. The cracks continue to widen, and eventually the arch's roof collapses as it's very vulnerable, which forms a stack, which then also collapses due to erosion, forming wave-cut notches. So you've got wave-cut notch, which is that bit of the foot of the cliff that has eroded before it collapses to form a wave-cut platform. So again, I'll just repeat the last bit. So you got a cliff, you got cracks, or joints even. Let's make the vocabulary more fancy. Erosion occurs, air gets in, the air gets in, it causes the cracks to expand, dislodges blocks of rock, continues to widen, forming an arch. Eventually the arch of the roof has got nothing below it supporting it, so it becomes vulnerable. and it collapses, even due to weathering on it, for example, such as the water from rain getting into cracks and causing freeze-fall weathering. Collapses, which results in a stack, and erosion keeps occurring at the foot of the cliff, at the foot of the stack, which causes it to collapse and form a stump. Pretty simple concept. Quite a bit to learn, but once you really get into it, it's fairly simple. So now we've got landforms arising from deposition. They're not too common in exam papers, I've noticed, but doesn't mean you shouldn't know them. You should still know them. So we'll begin with beaches. Wave refraction occurs, which reduces wave energy in a bay and deposits sand and shingle, for example. So beaches are basically accumulations of sand and shingle, and this is where deposition occurs, often in sheltered areas such as bays, and because the bays are curved, when waves enter this area, they refract, they become curved, so which is why wave refraction occurs, and this causes the waves to lose energy and therefore spread out on the bay and deposit sand and shingle. Next we've got spits, which is when sediments deposited due to longshore drift as it transports it where the coastline changes direction or where a river mouth is present. They become curved due to the waves approaching at different directions. And bars, longshore drift causes a spit to grow across a bay, which forms a lagoon behind it. So if I just draw that, if we've got a bay here, and then we've got a spit growing across it, eventually it will grow to the other side, and a lagoon forms in it. Forms over here. It's pretty hard to draw on PowerPoint, but you can kind of guess what. No, you can't, but that's basically what happens. So, rising sea level, one of my favorite topics. Isostatic sea level rise is caused by a fall in the height of the land, which occurs locally. Eustatic sea level rise, however, it occurs globally and it's caused by an increase in the volume of water in the oceans, such as the melting of a glacier. So you need to know a case study for this. So I have used the Maldives, very, very, very interesting case study to use actually. I need to color code this actually. So for red, we'll use for economic effects. So more money is spent on coastal management. You cannot read that. I will use a different color. I'll use yellow. So more money spent on coastal management, such as $63 million lent from Japan to build a 3-meter high seawall, which is proving ineffective, to be honest. And also there are less jobs as fishing industries fail due to more fish dying by rising temperatures. Fish is a main source of income in the Maldives actually. A lot of fishing farmers use it. Yeah, so I'll move on to social. I will use blue for that. We have got more erosion, destroys houses, and tourism decreases significantly due to erosion of beaches by storms. That could be economic as well, I guess, and environmental too. It's kind of a bit of all of it really, but mainly social, I guess, because people make less money. Environmental, I'll use purple for that. There are more storms. Oh god, you can't read that, but I haven't got another colour. So there are more storms due to changes in climate which damage coral reefs. Coral reefs are fairly, I really can't highlight today. Coral reefs are quite rare, I guess. They only found in tropical coastlines, so yeah, damages coral reefs. And 80% of the 1,196 islands are only 1 meter above sea level. That's pretty shocking because that's not quite a lot. It's not a lot. So these houses and businesses are quite likely to get flooded. And hopefully, if you want to go to the Maldives, go sometime soon because your children may just be able to go. Your grandchildren definitely won't. So, because the Maldives are expected to be completely gone by 2100 as sea level rises by 9 millimeters a year. So, moving on to cliff collapse, you need to know 2 ways as to how it's caused. So, mass movement by heavy rainfall, as you can imagine, you've got a permeable rock. It rains a lot. It soaks in because it's permeable. It adds to its weight and it collapses. And secondly, overhangs and undercutting by erosion. So as it happened with wave-cut platforms, a lot of erosion occurred at the foot of the cliff, which is known as undercutting, and it resulted in overhangs of rock which collapsed. Fairly simple, that's how it's caused. Where has it occurred? Well, it has occurred in Barton-on-Sea, which is in Hampshire. There was a landslip in 2008, so the residents became worried. And housing developments, which are 20 meters from the cliff edge, are predicted to be lost by 2040 by the local authority, which obviously the residents are going to be worried about, but you can't really stop erosion happening. So that is where cliff collapse has occurred. And why may it happen? Well, water ponds up due to the arrangement of rocks, which increases weight. As I said before, if you have permeable rock, the water from rainfall ponds up in it and increases its weight. It usually occurs in weak clays and sands because these are permeable. In Barton-on-Sea, for example, it may have occurred because it faces southwesterly winds, which causes a lot of erosion because of the pressure. And there are many streams around Barton-on-Sea which flow into the rocks, and again the water increases its weight, causing the cliff to collapse. So, hard engineering, there are three types. We'll begin with sea walls. It's a wall that's about 3 to 5 meters high with a curved top which refracts the waves back into the sea. And unfortunately, it usually costs £10 million per kilometer, which is quite a lot. But it is effective at stopping the sea as it refracts the waves back into the sea, so basically just causes them to curve and go back, essentially. And it also has a walkway for people to walk along, so it doesn't deter people from walking on it. Deter basically means like to stop, to prevent. The next one, groins. They are rock structures, and they can be built from timber as well. They're built out to sea, which stops sediment from being deposited on the shore, and it also broadens the beach and makes it more effective against incoming waves, and it costs up to £5,000 per meter. Fortunately, it does result in a bigger beach, which can increase tourism, and it is also quite useful for people interested in fishing because they can use this to fish. However, it does interrupt longshore drift, and it does deprive the beach further down where these groins aren't present of erosion, and they're also unnatural, and they can be quite unattractive. And lastly, we've got rock armor, which are large rocks at the foot of a cliff, which absorbs the wave's energy as they break against boulders, for example, or whatever's used there, and it costs between £1,000 and £4,000 per meter. So fortunately, it is quite cheap and quite easy to maintain, and again, it's quite good for people who are interested in fishing. However, the rocks may come from other parts of the beach or even other countries, or other part of the country, so it may not fit in with the local geology, and it is quite expensive to transport, especially because of their weight and their size. Next, we've got soft engineering. So beach nourishment is basically just adding sand and shingle to a beach to expand it, and it costs up to £3,000 per meter. So fortunately, again, it's quite cheap and easy to maintain and may increase tourism, and it also blends in with the existing beach. However, it needs constant maintenance, and because it does get carried away by destructive waves, for example, and it does get quite expensive eventually because you're gonna have to keep adding sand there. The next one, dune regeneration. They stop the sea and can be stabilized by marine grass, and they cost up to £2,000 per 100 meters. Fortunately, it maintains a natural coastal environment, so it can maintain biodiversity. It does not reduce biodiversity. It's also quite cheap, but it can be quite time consuming to plant the marine grass and fence off these areas to regenerate these dunes. And people they often don't care about rules, so they'll just trample on the grass and destroy it. And lastly, marsh creation, which is when low-lying coastal areas are allowed to be flooded, which forms a salt marsh, as they are effective at stopping the sea. It's quite a cheap way of maintaining the beach as a sea defense, and it also creates new habitats for new wildlife. But it does affect farmers as land is lost to the sea, and yeah, so farmers will need to be compensated for this. So last but not least, your last bit you need to know, a case study for coastal habitat, and I used KEYHAVEN marshes. What are common species at KEYHAVEN marshes? They are cordgrass, sea lavender, walled spider, and the oyster catcher bird. The sea lavender is pretty attractive, and its colourful flowers attract wildlife. The walled spider basically clings onto submerged stems of cordgrass, and it waits for low tide to come in so that they can get food. Cordgrass, as I said before, it grows near salt marshes and mudflats because they're pretty stable and they stabilize salt marshes. And what was the last bit? Oyster catcher birds. It's just a type of bird that finds food in salt marshes, really. Why is it under threat? Well, more tourism means there's more trampling of the marshes. It retreats up to 6 meters a year, which causes a tight gap between rising sea levels and the seawall that was built in the 1990s. Also, Hurst Castle Spit, very nearby to the marshes, is particularly vulnerable to breaching, especially during storms such as in 1989, when the marsh was eroded in under 3 months, when sediment covered the marsh, exposing 80 meters of it to the sea. What have they done to improve the area at KEYHAVEN? Well, they spent £5 million in 1996 on rock armour and beach nourishment, and since then it has been pretty safe. There have not been any worries expressed. And also it's carefully monitored to maintain its rich biodiversity, which includes wildfowl, and again, these over here, so cordgrass, sea lavender, walled spider, and the oyster catcher bird, as well as wildfowl. And it is part of the SSSI, which is the Site of Special Scientific Interest. So that was the specification for coasts covered. If you have any questions, just don't hesitate to email me. I'll put my email in the description below, or if you don't want to email me, then just comment something in the comment section. So just to end the video, I've got a quiz, so just pause the video and have a go at these questions and then press play and the answer on the next slide. So what do constructive waves form? They form beach berms. What is hydraulic action? The process of air being trapped into cracks from waves and causing them to expand, which dislodges blocks of rock. How do bars form? They form by spits growing across a bay, which forms a lagoon behind it. How much was spent on rock armour and beach nourishment in 1996 at KEYHAVEN marshes? £5 million. And is eustatic sea level rise global or local? It is global. So again, I hope this video has helped. Any questions, email me or leave a comment below. And yeah, thank you for watching.